So I wanted to make a budget gaming rig, and I was looking for a really inexpensive processor. I was looking for AMD processors, but the cheapest CPU that is available and in stock from AMD in my market is the Ryzen 5 3600, which is an all-round good CPU for its price, but it still costs around like $200 plus, and it doesn't really have the greatest single core performance. So then looking back at Intel, you have the Celeron, but that is a single core, and then you have the Pentium, which seems to be fairly available in stock, but that is also just dual core. So none of these processors here are good enough for running modern games. So I was looking for an i3 processor that is sold on the market today, and therefore I found this i3-10100f. This here is a locked processor, so we can't overclock it. It also doesn't have any integrated graphics, but personally I don't really think there's any processor with integrated graphics that I would personally want to use actually playing games on. So I got it for around $100, and it also seems to be in stock at a lot of places. And the LGA 1200 motherboards, you can find some cheaper versions of this that fits well with the Core i3. So if this processor here is not in stock and you want to find similar performance, you can maybe look at the i3 10100 without the F, so with integrated graphics. It will cost a little bit more, but it's not a big difference. Or you can maybe look for the 10105, and then you maybe see like a maximum 5% increase from my numbers here, but it maybe costs a little bit more, but not that much. But if you are not in a rush, it maybe makes more sense to wait for the 12th gen older like i3, the 12100f. I'm not sure how big the performance difference there will be, but the price of the CPUs seems to be the same. There's maybe like a 10 to 20% increase in the price, but I don't really know how much the performance differs. But also it maybe will be more expensive for the motherboards themselves, and also like the stock situation, if you're actually be able to buy those CPUs, the 12th gen. So if you want to build something right now, this here is a good viable option, and it's still very inexpensive, so it doesn't really take too long to save up for something like this. So I paired it with a 3080 to be totally bottlenecked by the CPU in 1080p, and we can see here in Warzone we actually get very good performance. 112 frames per second average is very good, and 0.1% low was like in the 50s as well, so overall a very good experience. Going to Vanguard and being bottlenecked by the CPU, it maybe differs a little bit by map and such, but a little bit of a larger map like this, we see that we get an average of 173 frames, and then that is the bottleneck because of the CPU. And we see the 0.1% low of 97, so there's absolutely no issue at all playing with this processor here, and I'm really happy overall if I were to have this setup here. It maybe doesn't make sense to have it paired with a 3080, but then we see that we need a fairly good GPU to actually be bottlenecked by the graphics card. So it maybe makes sense to pair this processor with a worse graphics card, which is cheaper, but then the performance isn't bottlenecked by the CPU, which is good. And here in CSGO we can see that we get an average of 230 frames a second, so it isn't like the best performing processor we see, but do you really need anything more than that? In my opinion, no. So it all comes down to like a number on a sheet. For me personally, it doesn't make sense to have a better performing CPU in CSGO, even though you maybe can compare it to another one and see that there is a performance difference, but I don't need more frames. And then we move on to Fortnite. We get the overall good average, but this was the worst performing game with this processor here. We get some low stuttering or low frame rate from like the stuttering, and we can see that the 0.1% is at just 14 FPS, and then you will actually notice those, and it happens fairly often, so it doesn't really get the best experience. And personally, if I were to like be a Fortnite player, I wouldn't want to have this kind of stutter. For me, like playing this match here once, and I've never even played Fortnite before, it's like okay for some casual playing, but if I were to play this as my main game and such, I couldn't accept that kind of stuttering. In Microsoft Flight Simulator, it didn't really seem to be any issue using this processor here as well. We can see here in 1080p we are always bottlenecked by the CPU, but we still get respectable frames for a game like Microsoft Flight Simulator. It performs good enough for a nice smooth experience. And here we are using the New York landing challenge in a big 747, and we can see when we get close to the ground we will have some stuttering and low frame rates, but this kind of stuttering I see with most CPUs at this landing challenge and area. So overall I think it's really good numbers, even though they could be better, but for the price and such we get really good experience. And it's a worst case scenario using a big airliner like that, looking in the inside the cockpit with the glass instruments and such, that drags the performance down. And here flying in New York, we are still bottlenecked by the CPU, so we see how well it performs, and we get like an average of 38, flying in like the worst kind of scenario when it comes to having to draw buildings and objects and other like traffic and such moving around. But we still see that we get high and respectable frame rate, which I don't see any issue like flying with and having a good experience. It wasn't really a big surprise to me, because flight simulators have always like been fairly bottlenecked by the main like thread or core on your CPU, so it doesn't really affect the performance if we were to like put in like a much better performing i9 or i7 processor, as long as they were like running at the same frequencies and such.